Well, good evening, and thank you to our in-person as well as our virtual audiences tonight. Those of you familiar with American Public Square may recall that it is our mission to bring people together to address polarizing and often contentious issues with civility, facts, and multiple perspectives.
As you'll hear tonight, there is significant disagreement about the most important causes for this rise in anti-Semitism, as there is about where the greatest threats lie in terms of anti-Semitism today.
Everyone on this panel represents a distinct aspect of what it's going to take to have the public safety that we want to have for Kansas City.
So to start us all off, I thought it would be good to ask your guys' perspectives as Gen Zers. How do you think things are going?
The George Floyd incident didn't happen here, but it touched a nerve across the country, and it started a conversation that needed to not just start but to continue. The problem is the voices have gotten so loud on both sides of the discussion, we can't talk.
So from my point of view, the problem here is the lack of social cohesion and the breakdown of something that unites us as Americans. And to me, the way you fight that is by finding people you disagree with and talking to them like they do at American Public Square.
We have this agenda right now to reduce carbon dioxide emissions when we're not facing a climate crisis.
So when I hear how this amendment is neutral, it's very concerning for my community because there is no neutral decision for a BIPOC community.
Violent crime has increased and sensible gun laws will save lives.
The reason that the state legislature wouldn't change policing is because they know they have a red meat issue.
Now that we've talked about so many of these issues, what do we do about them? So what, now what?
So what, Gen Z cares about politics. So what, Gen Z maybe disagrees with you on a lot of stuff.
So what? We have a very important decision on or before August 2nd.
Now what? Let's get back into this country into a place where teachers are respected, not vilified by legislation.
Now what? We need to work together to build a better society where 2/3 of all gun deaths in America aren't suicide.
We don't have to settle for the current partisan invective. Rather, we need to demonstrate a better way, especially to those who are young, before what they see around them becomes in their minds an acceptable way for our society to operate.
The message people living in democracy must understand, more than any other message, is that there are Americans who aren't just like you. They don't live like you, they don't have families like yours, and they don't think like you. They may not live in your neighborhood, but this is their country too. Thank you all for coming out, and good night. May we see you all again.
Good evening. My name is Dr. L. Michael McLeod. I serve as provost here at Johnson County Community College, and I want to welcome you to Yardley Hall and to this discussion that we're hosting tonight with American Public Square and the individuals from our collaboration center here at Johnson County. Johnson County takes great pleasure in being a convener in this community and helping people to come together to discuss what are sometimes tough ideas, because that is what a college does. As we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of this nation through our Constitution, I'm reminded that Patrick Henry said to guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Suspect everyone who approaches that jewel, for unfortunately, nothing will preserve it but downright force. Whenever you give up that force, you are inevitably ruined. While Patrick Henry spoke of force, understanding that flintlock rifles and marching soldiers at the time was what he was referring to, today we refer to that force as the force of one's heart and one's mind. At a time when we are devaluing ourselves in education, it is important that we continue as scholars to conduct ourselves in a way that promotes public discourse, allows us to speak with one another, both to agree and to disagree, but to expand our minds and to learn more about one another if we are to continue the promise of this nation that we are one and that our differences are what make us strong, not our similarities. Those are things that American Public Square pushes for us to think about, to consider, and to continue to keep in front of us. And it's something we hope that you take away from tonight's program. So welcome to Johnson County. Thank you so much for your time, for being the types of individuals who want to continue to learn more about our history, but also more about yourselves and the way that you fit within a society that makes us a great nation. And with that, I'd like to welcome Executive Director Claire Bishop, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Mickey, for that nice introduction. And hi, yes, I am Claire Bishop, Executive Director at American Public Square. I have the honor of giving a couple of opening remarks, and I know that what you all are really here to do is hear from this incredible panel that is here tonight to talk through the Declaration of Independence at 2:50. So I'm going to do my best to get through these as quickly as possible and get on to the real program. First, I'd like to welcome all of you in attendance in person tonight, as well as our virtual audience. I'd like to thank our partners here at the Johnson County Community College for hosting us tonight in this gorgeous venue and at the CoLab ahead of this program, and helping us to launch American Public Square's America at 250 celebration, especially during the World Cup festivities, which are exciting in this town. This event is presented in partnership with our friend Ken Thomas and the Kansas First Amendment Foundation as a part of the David J. Waxy Memorial Summer Lecture Series. It will be streamed on C-SPAN after the 4th of July as well, so we'll be sure to share that information as it becomes available, and we're delighted that through that partnership, we'll bring tonight's conversation to a wider audience. Just quickly, a show of hands, how many people in the audience are American Public Square members? Just raise your hand. Oh my goodness, look at that. That's incredible. Well, let's give our members a quick round of applause. Your support makes evenings like this possible and allows us to keep our programming free and accessible to the entire community. If you didn't raise your hand, tonight is a perfect time to become a member. Memberships start at just $25 a year for students and educators and $75 a year for everybody else. Tonight, you'll receive a free APS tote bag. I brought one up to show you if you choose to sign up. So you'll take that with you, along with a couple of drink tickets for the post-event reception if you choose to sign up as a new member this evening, and I hope you will. If you know someone who would enjoy being a part of the APS community, memberships can also be given as gifts. So please stop by and speak with one of our staff members after the program to learn more. Before we start, I have a couple of exciting opportunities to highlight quickly. American Public Square is honored to serve as one of the host communities for the Aspen Institute's Weave, the Social Fabric Project, and the 2026 Weaver Awards. We'll be helping to distribute $2,500 microgrants to local community builders who are strengthening connection across our region. Applications open July 1st and close August 7th. You can learn more at our website, americanpublicsquare.org. We're excited to announce that sponsorship opportunities are now available for our signature year-end event, Evening at the Square, on December 7th. This year's program will feature a conversation between GOP political strategist Annie Kelly Keel and former Obama administration official and Pod Save America host Ben Rhodes, moderated by KCTV5's Lauren Magarino. It's shaping up to be a remarkable evening. And now, for more information on APS Civility Toolkit, which will help guide not only our panelists' remarks, but your participation. Please take a moment to review the toolkit, which is featured in your program, in your printed program, and on the homepage of the APS website. Several members of the audience have civility bells. They're out there. These would be rung if the tone of the conversation becomes less than civil and needs to be redirected. Finally, in the interest of keeping the conversation flowing, we ask that you not clap, shout, or yell during the program. For audience members that are in person, you will see question cards and fact check cards around the auditorium. When you have a question or fact check, please write it on your card and hold it up. A volunteer will come by to collect it and provide it to our roving reporter and fact-checking teams. Tonight's roving reporter is Michael Price, a journalist and faculty member here at Johnson County Community College. Our fact checker is Alan Rostron, Associate Dean at UMKC Law, and he is assisted this evening by several UMKC Law students. For those of you watching virtually, please email questions or fact checks to ryan@americanpublicsquare.org. Our roving reporter will do their best to pull out major themes and present them to our panel at intervals during the program. Now, true to the APS spirit of maximizing discussion, our distinguished panelists have asked us to include their impressive bio info in your written programs and not to introduce them orally now. So you're welcome for that, because if I was doing those, we would be here all night, and I know you want to get to the conversation. So tonight I'll be introducing our panelists, including our fabulous moderator, by title only. So I'll start with our moderator, Nadine Strassen. She describes herself as a full-time free speech evangelist and a very good, I would even say dear friend of American Public Square. Our panelists, in alphabetical order by last name, are, and also how they're seated on stage, Akil Reed Amar, Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University. Dr. Lindsay Travinsky, Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library, and Yuval Levin, who holds several leadership positions at the American Enterprise Institute. So I've gotten through it all, and it is now my distinct pleasure to hand over the microphone to Nadine Strassen, who will begin the conversation. Nadine?
Oh, thank you so much, Claire, and thank the audience. And I'd also like to thank the distinguished provost for his inspiring remarks. Our discussion this evening is shaped by the core values of the American Public Square, APS, including fact-based dialogue, honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, and a deeper understanding of diverse and divergent perspectives. Consistent with these values, tonight's discussion is going to avoid a simplistic binary approach, which unfortunately has been too common in discussing many controversial topics, including our nation's founding ideals and documents. At least for those of us who are history buffs and constitutional law scholars, these are hot topics, our nation's founding documents and ideals. So here is APS's compelling charge to our distinguished panelists. Please guide us beyond either pole of pure celebration or pure cynicism about the Declaration of Independence. Instead, please share with us a constructive report card on how we have and have not lived up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. So I'm going to start with a lightning round. I'm going to give each of you, I am going to give each of you an opportunity to address positive aspects where you think we have succeeded and negative aspects. But before we get to that, I would like a lightning round where I'm going to ask each of you to just give a letter grade to how we have done overall with respect to the Declaration's founding ideals. No gradation, please, and no comments. You'll have a chance to comment, but first I'm going to start in alphabetical order, the order in which you're seated. Your grades, please, professors.
A.
B.
B.
So some divergence. Okay. Now let's start with detailed explanations. And first, let's start with the positive. Where have our founding ideals been most greatly lived up to, and that would make the founders most proud if they were able to look ahead and see how the Declaration's ideals had fared, starting with Akil?
Parts of America abolished slavery by democratic actions before anyone in the world had done anything like that, beginning in Pennsylvania in 1776 to 1780 and Massachusetts in 1780, led by people like Ben Franklin and John Adams, who were there in July 1776. So that's way before the Brits. Now that's not all of America, but we got it started early. And in my lifetime, we elected Barack Obama. Wow, that's a long way to have gone. And we moved from just a paltry collection of folks on the eastern seaboard to become the most powerful and influential nation in the world today. So if that doesn't get an A, who does? The Chinese, the Russians? Oh, the Brits are not doing so well. So if I'm grading and no one gets an A,
Grading on a curve. Thank you so much. So, Lindsay, you came up with a B, but what are the most positive aspects that feed into your evaluation?
3 things. So first, the list of grievances, which for a long time took me, when I was talking to students about them, they found them to be quite boring. I highly encourage you all to read them. They're not going to read boring today. But we instilled protections in our Constitution through a Bill of Rights to ensure that many of those grievances would not again be a problem for future generations. 2, the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence claims for the collection of states the right to conduct treaties, to make, to conduct war, to wage war, to provide for the national defense, and of course to engage in economic activity on behalf of the whole nation. These are the powers of what it means to be a sovereign nation. I don't think anyone would disagree that the federal government has held firmly to those powers. And 3, if we view the preamble not as a set of statements as to where we are or where we were in 1776 or where we are today, but rather as a mission statement, a charge for each generation to try and make the nation a little bit more perfect, then I think for most of American history, generations have taken that charge and tried to move the nation forward.
Thank you so much. And another B grade, what are the positive aspects, Yuval?
For me, B is a very high grade. So I guess if I graded by a curve, I would say no one's done better than the United States. That's certainly my view. But if we judge ourselves by the standard of the Declaration, I think we've done tremendously well, but we have room to improve and to revitalize. I think what the founders might have been most proud of is just the simple fact that we are here 250 years later, and we not only remember what they did, we take it to have been our beginning. We take it to be a project that we continue. 250 years is a long time. The United States is, I think in some respects, the United States is the oldest regime in our world now. It's the only society that has more or less the same system of government that it did in 1800. The Brits could say that, but they would be wrong. Their institutions have the same names they had in 1800. We really trace our lineage to that beginning, and the sheer durability of it is, I think, a real tribute to what they gave us and to what we've done with it. I also think, secondly, that we are better now at living out that extraordinary second paragraph than they were. We mean it more when we say that we believe that we are all created equal. We show it more. We're not perfect at it, but we're awfully good at it. And I do think that in that sense, we've lived up to that ideal. We've helped to show what it could mean, even beyond what that generation itself showed it to mean. And so I think at least in those respects, we just have an awful lot to show for 250 years, and they would have an awful lot to be proud of.
Any of you want to comment on each other's remarks? Okay.
I agree with Yuval that, of course, there's room for improvement, and going forward, we have a lot to do.
Well, that brings us to the next question, which is the more negative aspect of your assessment. What do you think in this remarkable span of 250 years would be the greatest disappointment to the framers? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me start with Lindsay this time.
So I think there are, I'm going to go with 3 things again, where I think we could make some room for improvement. I mentioned those grievances and why and how we put in place protections, and yet some of those protections have proven insufficient when met with, I think, nefarious actors. And so there is space there for ongoing improvement. The all men created equal phrase would be the second thing. And that is a very high bar, which we have come close at various times to getting close to, but Oftentimes, moments of incredible reform and forward movement are met with backlash. And I think we are in a moment of backlash. And so that knocks my grade from A down a bit. The last thing that I think that I would say is at the very end of the last paragraph, the signers of the Declaration of Independence pledged their sacred honor to one another to uphold this pact. And they took it seriously because they understood that institutions in a republic are fragile and they require the participation of citizens to uphold them and to care about them. And it does require us pledging our sacred honor or our commitment or our civic virtue to these things. And I think we are at a point where a lot of Americans have forgotten that that's required or no longer wish to pledge their sacred honor. And that, to me, is a concern.
Their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And there have been some surveys recently that show that large percentages of young people would not fight to preserve this country even against a foreign invasion. Yuval?
I think when I look at where we're not measuring up in our time in particular, I really start with the beginning of those grievances, which were all about the centrality of legislative prerogatives. They had a tremendous concern with the dangers involved in a certain kind of executive power overtaking the Republican character of what, even for them, living as colonies of a distant monarchy, was not only understood but experienced as a form of self-government. And self-government requires legislative government. I think we're living in a moment now, and I don't just mean in the last few years, but in the last generation and more, we've lived in a time when legislative prerogatives have increasingly been overwhelmed by executive power. It's not about this president or the previous one. It's about really a generation now of Americans understanding their own mode of self-government in a way that I think would have been a disappointment to the generation that wrote the Declaration of Independence. And to my mind, the grievances begin to point to places where we could improve, even though they certainly also point us to some ways in which we've addressed problems that they saw. And I also think that the way in which we understand that generation as our predecessors, it leaves a lot of room for improvement. We fight with each other about whether they were perfect or they were perfectly terrible. And they were not perfect, and they were not perfectly terrible. They're our ancestors, whether we were born here, whether our parents and grandparents were born here or not. As Lincoln put it in 1858, the Declaration of Independence means that we are blood and of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the people who wrote that declaration, if we believe what they said. And to the extent that we do, we have to think about them as we do of prior generations of our own society who created the institutions, the modes of life that are available to us. They're here for us to improve, and they're here for us to appreciate. And if we can't do both, then we can't do either.
Akil?
So I think we don't know as much as we should about our history as a people and our institutions. And these are the only things that hold us together because we don't have that many other things in common: race, national origin, religion, first language, politics, even geography. So if we don't know as much as we need to about the presidency, about the 14th Amendment, about the Declaration of Independence, how are we supposed to vote every 4 years for a president or every 2 years for a Congress? How are we supposed to evaluate whether the Supreme Court, which is doing things in our name, is getting it right or wrong? So I think the only thing that we have in common is our history as Americans and our institution as Americans. I don't think we know enough about that, and we do enjoy the blessings of liberty, and we have to be free to live free lives, but we're spending too much time on the World Cup and not enough time on the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here because they're not at the World Cup. They're here.
Exactly.
Akil,
and thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
For your service to our country, because that's what it's about. This is a certain kind of public virtue to not just, and everyone's entitled to have some hobbies and commitments, and I was trivializing with the World Cup. You want to spend time on your family, on your faith, on things that are meaningful to you, but you also have to spend time on us.
I think of the great Justice Louis Brandeis from the early 20th century, who held many high public offices even before being appointed to the Supreme Court. And he said the title of which he was the proudest was the title citizen. And by that, I have to be very clear that we're not talking about the legal concept of American citizen. We're talking about a member of this community, and that as we have rights, we also have responsibilities. So I'd like to follow up with you, Akil, and then give the same opportunity to the other panelists. As an activist, and an educator, I'm always interested in. So what do we do about it? What would you recommend in terms of restoring more civic knowledge and participation? You probably know that some state governments are mandating that civics be taught in high schools and other K through 12 schools. There was recently issued a broadside that was sponsored by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, urging that universities require at least one semester of study in American history or politics, given surveys that show a very distressing lack of knowledge on the part of college students. By the way, the only members of the American public who consistently do show a great deal of knowledge are naturalized citizens, because they've been required to learn this. So, Akil, what would you recommend to repair this great problem that you've noted?
There are two halves, I think, when we think about civic education and civic engagement. They mutually reinforce. On civic education, I think part of it is reading, and our younger generation, this is our fault, the older generation, don't read as much, don't read books, even fiction books. They, in English class, they're saying excerpts of books. But what's an excerpt? War and Peace. Oh, a chapter on war. Oh, a chapter on peace. No, that's not War and Peace. Okay, you got to read the whole Tolstoy book. Okay, so civic education would be reading books like the books of my colleagues here about American history and American institutions, because it doesn't come naturally. There are music prodigies and math prodigies, and they just intuit music and math, but history isn't like that. American history isn't like that. You need to know our history, and if you don't have enough in common with your fellow citizens. That's civic education. Now, civic engagement will be voting, serving on juries, paying your taxes, obeying the law, even when, for example, not cheating on your taxes. It's a voluntary system to a very great extent. These are components of civic virtue. When your country asks you to serve in some capacity, answering that call, engaging with your neighbors and other members of your community and in civil discourse, showing up to things like this. And again, thank you for your service. And I think they mutually reinforce. If you serve on a jury, Tocqueville called juries a free public school, always open, teaching people their rights and responsibilities. And it's a hassle, yes, but the idea is you're coming together with your fellow citizens, and it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, and people live in different neighborhoods and worship in different faith communities and have very different positions in the economy. Right now, the interaction between them is very modest between people over here and people over there. And it's just as you're, driving home and you drive through a fast food restaurant. Your interaction with someone from a different strata is hearing on an intercom, "Will you have fries with that, sir?" But on a jury, you're talking to people, and they're not from your neighborhood, and they aren't maybe in your faith community. You might not have engaged with them before, but they're equal citizens. And you say, well, the police officer, is obviously very credible, and this is what he said, and someone else says, "Are you kidding? Cops always lie." And you say, "Really?" And now you're starting to talk to each other about their perception of reality and yours, and we need to have fact-based discussions. But I love juries. I think you can teach, and here's the fine thing, because I said civic education, civic engagement, they're connected. Teaching doesn't have to just be reading boring books. It can be role plays. Okay, you're going to be a jury. We're going to do an historical role play, and you're Frederick Douglass, and you're Harriet Beecher Stowe, and you're Abraham Lincoln, and now I'm going to bring you in a room, and you're going to talk about how to think about the Emancipation Proclamation, or what have you. And now you're learning how to be a citizen. You're learning, you're practicing the stuff that this organization is all about.
Wonderful. Lindsay, for your 3 negative grades, you have any suggestions how to improve the grades?
Well, I think a huge part of what we're all sort of talking about is how to re-engage as a civic community and as a quilt of what it means to be a community. And I think that part of the problem is we have come to conflate citizenship with just voting. And I actually think, or a box that you check when you're filling out a form, whether you're a citizen or not. And I think instead it really needs to be viewed as a verb. And this is essential for, especially I think for younger people. As Nadine said, there is such a low level of trust in institutions, especially among younger generations. Not just that the institutions will respond to their wishes or address their needs, but that the democratic institutions as a whole actually can work. And one way that we can try to begin to restore trust is to teach people which institution does what. Who actually is in charge of fixing your roads? Who is actually in charge of local education policy? Who is actually in charge of what funding a community college receives? Who is actually in charge of economic policy, maybe under normal circumstances? And I think that knowledge is power, because the knowledge will then teach people how to engage in a way that will actually help them get what they want, or to hold accountable people who don't speak to their needs. But that has to start at a local level. To be sure, a classroom is a great place to learn that, and I think we should have more of it in our schools. But there are a lot of places where we can teach people the type of engagement that is required. Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts can do projects about what it means to actually be a citizen. Maybe they can volunteer at a polling place. You have various other kids organizations. Maybe we should ask our sports teams who, by the way, I'm a big sports fan, and I think you can read really big, smart books and still be a sports fan, and both of those are okay. But they receive a lot of tax credits in order to build their stadiums. Maybe they should also participate in civic engagement as part of that. Maybe when they have camps for students or for kids every summer, one morning of that should be, let's go do a civic engagement activity. I think we need to teach people to be a part of the community again, and what that requires and the responsibilities along with it.
I see that our roving reporter has approached the microphone, but if you don't mind, Michael, I'm going to give Yuval a chance to tell us how we can repair the enormous problems that he's pointed to.
Well, let me follow up on this question of civics education, which I think is very important. I would also say that the World Cup is going to take up a lot of my next 6 weeks, so I will now feel a tinge of shame having been put in my place by Akil, but I am a fan.
No shame, no shame.
I think that the essential beginning of civic identity, and both Lindsay and Akil have pointed in this general direction too, is a sense of ownership of a common future with our fellow citizens, a sense of responsibility. And I'll tell you very quickly how I came to think of this subject when I became an American citizen. I'm a naturalized citizen. I came to the United States when I was 8 years old. I became an American citizen when I was 19, and I've told Akil this story before. The judge who gave us the oath in the federal courthouse in Newark, New Jersey, after he did it, he stepped up to give a speech, and I can distinctly remember thinking he's going to talk about Washington and Lincoln and tell us about history. And he said this very strange thing to us, and the strangeness of it has never left me. He said, from now on, you have to think and talk about America in the first person plural. I will admit to you that I literally did not know what that meant, but he told us. He said, you have to say we and us when you start to talk about Americans. And I have since over and over returned to that little piece of advice, because it's not just advice for new citizens. It's not just advice for immigrants to this country. It's advice that all of us have to take. When we talk about our national challenges, we have to start by talking about them in terms of we and not they. Our problems are not they. Our problems are all of ours. And just the simple habit of understanding that whatever you might think of people on the other side of our politics from you, they are your neighbors, your fellow citizens, the people with whom you will build a future. To understand it that way and to see our politics as a way of figuring out how to do that with these very people, and to say we and mean everyone in this country, is a habit that we've fallen out of and that we need to recover. And I think a lot of civic engagement is ultimately a way of saying, not what are they going to do about what they did, but what are we going to do about what we need? And by just beginning that way, each of us is already in a better place for civic formation, civic education, than our culture tends to put us in now.
And of course, those are the opening words of the Constitution. We the people, which I am reading on Akil's socks.
Yes. And, you know, that wonderful second paragraph of the Declaration begins with that word, too. We hold these truths to be self-evident. They're ours.
Well, now we have our roving reporter, Professor Michael Price.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions as well. Do keep them coming. You hand those to those who are helping collect them, and they'll bring them down to the front. But I've got one here which I think is for the whole panel, which is the Declaration of Independence was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. At the time, that wasn't the case for many Americans. Arguably, that's not the case today either. How can we rededicate our belief that all men are and women created equal?
Any of you want to? Lindsay, you already addressed that to some extent.
Yeah, so there are a couple of different interpretations for what they actually meant by that. One interpretation is that all men born in the state of nature are created equal. And then, of course, society does other things and creates other different categories. Another argument is that under the British system, white men were created equal, and it was very much a response to the colonial tensions and the restrictions on colonists that didn't exist on white men in London. And I think, you know, the third interpretation is very much an Enlightenment one of this aspiration that we will all be created equal. I'm not sure it matters which one Jefferson was actually thinking about, because we have the language, and the language has inspired future generations. It inspired Martin Luther King when he quoted from it standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It inspired revolutions around the globe in Haiti and France and Greece and other nations. And so I think it's one of those statements that it is important what it means to you. It is important what it means to us. It is not so much important what it meant to Jefferson at that time, because he is long dead and he's not coming back. And so to me, I think what's inspirational is, what do we want it to mean? One of the great, amazing things about the founding generation is that they knew they did not have all the answers. They knew there were problems they were intentionally sweeping under the rug. Slavery was perhaps the most obvious. And they desperately hoped that future generations would come up with more creative and better solutions to the problems they couldn't fix and the problems they couldn't even begin to envision. And so if that was their expectation, then By not doing that, by not trying to improve and come up with more creative solutions, we are letting down that founding legacy. And so I think it matters, what do we want it to mean, and how do we then try and live up to it?
Other panelists, I think we have other questions too, right? But other panelists want to comment on
Yeah,
this one?
this is so big. These are essentially contested words, these 5 words. In the middle of a big fat book I just recently published called Born Equal, I identified 10 different ways of just interpreting those 5 words based on the Lincoln-Douglas debates and conversations in the 1850s, from very narrow to very broad. Lindsay identified about 3 of the 10. I'm with Lincoln, and here's his thought. And he then he went further than what he initially thought. He said, in a just society, anywhere in the world, and America wasn't entirely just society, every colony is a slave colony on July 1st, 1776. Everyone has slavery. But in a just society, every person, every human being is born equal in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're not born equally tall or strong, but meaning that in a proper, just society, no one is born a slave and no one is born a slave master, because we're all members of the same species. If I encounter a wild animal in the wilderness, a horse, a rabbit, I can tame it, I can capture it, I can possess it, I can make it my own, I can sell it. I can't do that to a fellow human being because they're not a tameable beast of the field. Now, that might not have been Jefferson's full understanding. But it's Franklin's. And immediately, that month, in what we call Independence Hall, they called it the Pennsylvania State House, he presides over a state constitutional convention that opens with the words, "All men are born equally free and independent," and it leads to the abolition of slavery. This is a big thing in July 1776. And, immediately, shortly after that, John Adams, who's there in July 1776, presides over a Massachusetts Constitution that ends slavery, with a state constitution that begins, "All men are born free and equal." So this is the first world's abolition project. Not everyone is interpreting it that way. It's a northern abolitionist project, and eventually it's going to lead to Abraham Lincoln. And on this account, and South Carolina doesn't abide by that, Jefferson believes it but doesn't do it, we actually have lived up to this, in that we have a 13th Amendment that pretty much actually does operate. We're equally free in America. We don't have slavery as such anymore, chattel slavery, and almost everyone in the world had forms of unfreedom in 1775, and America had chattel slavery everywhere in 1775, and we don't. But Lincoln's going to grow. In Lincoln-Douglas debates, he says, I don't believe in Negro citizenship. That's a different thing than equal freedom. People aren't sure about equal voting, black and white, or equal voting, male and female. So there are different ways of interpreting these very contested words. But if in the narrowest sense, I think coming from Locke, equal in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, equal in being free, and no one being born a master, and no one being born a slave, that's why I gave us an A, actually, because we actually do that today, and we started doing that from day one. Some of us.
You will.
I would only add, I think the strength of those words comes from the simple fact that they are true. They are true. They were true at the beginning of time. They will be true at the end of time. They are true now. We can pretend they're not, and then we would be wrong, and we do that, and we are wrong. A lot of people do it, and they're wrong too. To see their truth is to see that there are demands made of us by the ideal of justice that are hard to meet, but that ultimately demand that we take them seriously and that we take them up in our political life. And I think there's a way that those words have always kind of stood there throughout American history and tapped the table and said, look, this is here. And there have always been people who've said, well, not those people. And the Declaration just says all. It just says all to us. And all the tough questions we face about who counts and who doesn't, and who belongs and who doesn't, the Declaration has an answer. We don't have to accept it, but I do think it's true. And ultimately, the strength of it is not rhetorical And the strength of it is not a matter of simple political persuasion. The strength of it, the reason why our application of it has grown over time, the reason why we felt it judging us when we don't abide by it, is that it is true. And there's no greater source of strength for an argument.
Thank you so much. Another question, roving reporter?
Yes, I've got one more here. Yeah. Can you place the rise of the expanded and all-powerful executive, and what can you explain this trend as well?
Well, I'm tempted to ask Yuval, but you would disagree with the premise, I think. So,
Well, thankfully, the executive's not all powerful, and our presidents all learn that eventually. I think there are ways that our current president has learned that currently. But the executive is, I think, too powerful in this moment. Now, I would say we've seen this come in waves. The American system is built in a way that experiences imbalance as a kind of vacuum that demands action. And so we have seen periods of excessive executive power followed by periods of legislative reassertion. And vice versa, by the way. There have been periods when Congress has been much too strong and when the other branches have pushed back on that front too. I think we can learn now from moments in our history when strong executive power over time has been followed up by a kind of legislative reassertion. In the wake of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, in some ways in the wake of Richard Nixon too, there have been awakenings of legislative power. Sometimes they've been partisan, sometimes they haven't been. A year and a half after Franklin Roosevelt died, Congress sends the states an amendment to the Constitution to limit the president to 2 terms. The people who voted for that amendment in Congress did not hate Franklin Roosevelt. They did not expect that voters would think Roosevelt did anything terrible, but they thought executive power had gone too far, and they saw a need and an opportunity to act. I don't despair of Congress doing that. I think it'll take work. I think it'll take public arguments, too, for the need for that. But our system is built to allow for those kinds of rebalancings. It operates by conflict, and so one branch will push too hard, and over time, the others will respond. I hope we can see that, and I think we could.
Lindsay?
I agree with much of that. I think that we do have a cyclical nature to the balances of power. We were speaking last night, and I mentioned that there are periods of time that often people forget the order of presidents. They typically come in the 1840s and early 1850s, and then in the late 1880s and early 1890s. And partly that's because some of those presidents were duds, and partly it's because Congress was really strong. And so the presidents didn't have as much impact, certainly as one would today, but also on our public memory. I think there are a couple of things that perhaps make the last couple of decades particularly unique, and Yuval has touched on one of them, which is the subordination by Congress intentionally to the executive branch. This is a bipartisan, multi-decade process in which Congress has neutered itself and handed over a lot of its authority to practice oversight of both the executive and the judiciary. I think that's a really important piece of this story. And so as a result, we haven't seen the type of pushback by legislative authority that I think has probably been warranted at several different points. So, for example, depending on who is in office, you usually can get both parties to agree that reform to the president's war powers is essential. It's just hard to get people in both branches of Congress and the president of the same party to all agree at the same time. So I think that is problem one. Problem two is part of that cycle has also been a Supreme Court cycle where there have been various cycles of the Supreme Court where they have granted the executive more authority than at other times. And we are in a moment where the Supreme Court, by and large, is I'm keenly aware that I'm on the stage with lawyers and I am not one, but I don't think the Constitution just belongs to lawyers. I think it belongs to all of us. So I will say that I think that the Supreme Court has allowed the executive to expand its authority and has at times been quite deferential to executive authority in ways that it has not been at other periods in American history.
Did you want to add to that, Akil?
Just real quickly, this term, the Supreme Court smacked down the signature economic policy of the president is tariffs. He's a Republican, and 4 of the 6 Republican appointees on the court voted to smack him down. He put 3 people on the court. 2 of those 3 voted to smack him down. That's interesting. And they smacked down President Biden's initiatives on COVID and on certain big environmental initiatives and student loan forgiveness. And I'm going to publicly predict, and boy, I could look really stupid in 2 weeks, but I'm publicly predicting that in the birthright citizenship case, at least 7 justices will vote to smack down an executive policy issued on day 1, an executive proclamation. At least 7, could be 8 or 9. There's a congressional statute as well as a constitutional provision involved, so we will see.
Okay, but I gotta jump in because we believe in good civil disagreement here. I agree that that the Supreme Court have smacked down policies of the current president and the former one. But the same court also basically granted immunity to presidents for massive actions that we would not have previously considered to be immune. So wouldn't you agree that as a broad overall swath, not cherry picking specific cases, this Supreme Court has granted, it is generally in favor and deferential to executive authority?
So I do agree, my friend Lindsay, that the immunity case about a year ago for ex-presidents was a very, very bad decision. I went on MSNBC and I waved my pocket constitution, and they said they just made the Constitution unconstitutional. I wrote a piece in the Atlantic. I have a free weekly podcast. That week it was entitled Disgrace. I thought that was the worst decision of the last 10 years or so, at least. But even that one, which I really don't like, I agree with you, and I think they just didn't follow the Constitution. That was a decision in which they said ex-presidents are generally immune from criminal prosecution for things that they did as president, even for corrupt reasons, criminal reasons. If they pardoned someone in exchange for a bribe, or they made a treaty in exchange for a bribe, or vetoed a bill in exchange for a bribe, you can't go after them after the presidency, or at least that's what the court seemed to say. And I said, wow, you just made that up. The Constitution doesn't say that. No one at the founding said that. The Nixon tapes case doesn't say that. So I agree, my friend. But you know, the people today, here's what's kind of ironic, that are most thankful for that decision. Their names are Joe Biden and Barack Obama, because that decision immunizes them from the Trump Justice Department. So, but I agree with you, my dear friend, that was a bad decision. But I think it was actually somewhat unusual. I really disliked Bush versus Gore. I disliked a case called Shelby County. But I'll say it a different way. The judiciary, I think, is the least dysfunctional of the 3 branches. It's the branch.
That's a really low bar right now. Just saying.
Yeah, I hear you.
I agree with you. I agree with you, my friend. I agree with you, but it's a little bit low bar.
But one thing that I do mean, because this is about civil discourse across that, and one just mode of civic engagement is just like reading op-eds that you from media outlets that you don't like, talking to people that you disagree with. That's civic engagement too. We have not just freedom of speech, but a duty to listen. That's part of the responsibility. But in Washington, D.C., Democrats almost never cross the line to join Republicans and vice versa. But routinely, not most of the time, but still way more than anywhere else in D.C., Republicans join Democrats.
On the court.
On the court. And it's interesting.
Thank you. Yuval is itching to say something, but briefly, please.
Yeah, sure. I just to enter this storm of friendship here, I'm not a lawyer either, and it's worse than that. I'm a political scientist, but I do think that there's a way to see what the court is doing on this question that might draw a distinction that I think maybe you're both getting at. I think this court has been very friendly to presidential power over the executive branch and very unfriendly to presidential power over the system as a whole. And they have the course of this court's administrative law decisions has restrained presidential power very significantly now for 15 years. The executive, relative to the other branches, I do think has come out weaker from the court's important decisions on this front. But the president is more in charge of the executive branch.
Own branch. Yeah. And by that, I think you all means things like, just for the law folks out there, major questions, doctor.
Exactly.
Okay. So now we have Dean Alan Rostron, our chief fact checker, backed up by some of his UMKC law students.
All right. Yes, it is time for fact checking. This is a great panel who truly doesn't need much policing in their use of the facts, but we always feel we can enhance the facts even if they don't need correction. Professor Amar early on mentioned how we can take pride in the fact that American states, some American states, abolished slavery relatively early by democratic means, which is true. And it made me interested to look up what was the first nation as a whole to abolish slavery. And credit for that is given to France because in 1315, Louis X made a decree to abolish slavery within France. While it prohibited it on the soil of the French mainland, it never was applied later to their colonies. So, for example, they did permit slavery in places like Haiti, which eventually became the first and only country to self-liberate from slavery. We sometimes get fact-check requests from the audience, and I had one that I wanted to just say a bit about. They asked about, does the Declaration of Independence have anything to say about judicial selection, whether by election or appointment? Does it say anything about judicial independence? And my initial thought was, well, no, I don't think it would. That's really not within the nature of what it was addressing. But I thought, well, I'll look it up. And so I was wrong, and so I will fact-check myself, which is a good thing to be able to do. It does mention, in fact, that one of the grievances against King George was that he was manipulating the judiciary, that he had made them dependent on his will alone because he controlled the tenure of their offices and their salaries as well. So they were, at that time, discussing the need for real independence from the crown. I do have two law students with me tonight. Danielle is going to say a bit about what survey data tells us about young Americans' willingness to fight for the country. And Sophie will say a bit about the extent to which young people are reading books versus excerpts from books.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'm Danielle, and so I found a poll from 2022 that asked if the U.S. was invaded by a foreign country, would you stay and fight or flee to another place? And overall, 55% said fight and 38% said leave. But then it was broken down by age, and from an age range of 18 to 34 years old, 45% said stay and 48% said flee.
I'm Sophie, and I looked at reading statistics, and as of 2025, a Gallup poll found that 35% of kids K through 12 dislike reading, and then 43% rarely or never read for fun. But then in 2024, the New York Times did some investigation to test scores, and they found that in 2024, 12th grade scores were at historic lows. They had the worst score since 1992, and even college professors were increasingly having issues getting students to engage with longer or more difficult texts. And teachers of elementary and high schools noted that their purchased curriculums from the school districts were focusing on shorter reading assignments.
Thank you so much for those sobering fact checks.
Sell your bonds.
So, we've already talked a bit about the grievances, the specific grievances. Alan mentioned one. Lindsay, you said that it's a very important aspect of the Declaration that's not so often attended to. So the next question I'd like to ask each of you, and I think it's your turn to go first, Yuval, of the specific grievances, which one do you think, one or two, we've done the best in redressing? And then the converse, where are we still having basis for grievance, ongoing grievance.
Yeah, interesting. I think the later grievances that touch on more of what we would now call individual rights, violations of property, quartering of troops, those are ones we've addressed pretty well. And in fact, if you look at elements of the Bill of Rights, you can see them speaking directly to those grievances and addressing directly what was still a living memory for a lot of Americans in their own lives in the years that led up to the Revolution. I think that the early grievances, which really describe a kind of mode of government, the Declaration says in its second paragraph that it's more or less ambivalent about forms of government. It says the people can create a government of any form that they deem would support their safety and happiness. But actually, the grievances describe a mode of government. They complain about an overweening executive. They complain about the executive actually failing to do his own job as an executive. And they worry about the loss of the independence of the judiciary, as we heard. In a sense, the Declaration gestures toward what a legitimate government would need to look like. And as I suggested before, I think that's an area where we now are not as strong as we ought to be.
Akil.
The declarations are written actually, the Declaration is written in a kind of ascending order. So the most serious of the grievances are at the very end, and they're two really. The war has already begun. He has already started slaughtering us. Okay, on December 8th, 1941, Franklin Roosevelt said a state of war already exists because of Pearl Harbor. So Lexington and Concord are 1775. Bunker Hill is earlier in 1776. More than 1,000 people have already died or have been wounded in combat, many of them Brits. And the King of England is sending forth the largest amphibious invasion, cross-Atlantic invasion in the history of the world to that point. 30,000 troops, and they're about to, and they're going to slit our throats, men, women, and children. So the king has already declared Americans out of his protection. And the basic deal is allegiance for protection. I'll be loyal to you and you'll protect me. And he's saying, I'm going to kill you. And he's not listening. We are sending these petitions. This isn't the first time we've identified a list of things that we'd like him to address. There's the Olive Branch petition and many others, and he's not listening at all. He refuses to let the petitions even be read to him. That's what Lin-Manuel Miranda is capturing with the king who says, dude, I can't hear you. Da, 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 da. Okay, so if he's slaughtering us and he won't listen to us, so as bad as government is today, that's not what we have. They're not, and I know the criticisms of ICE and other things, but this isn't mass slaughter. And they have to listen to us, because if they don't, we'll vote the bums out, because we actually have regular elections. So I think actually there are many things that we can do much better, but I think the Declaration of Independence is basically being respected. If you ask the biggest lapse, they loved jury trials. Big time. Huge. Every state has jury trials. And we have it nominally today, but we don't have it really. And this creates more distrust because they're not participating in government. They're not connecting to each other. They don't go into courtroom and see that basically the judges aren't on the take. The judges are pretty darn honorable and honest people, and ordinary citizens aren't actually seeing that. Yes, jury trials are expensive, but if you only see the price of something and you don't see the value. So I think juries more than pay for themselves in the long run, and we don't have nearly enough of them, civil or criminal.
Lindsay?
So as a historian, I'm duty-bound to return to the primary source. So you forgive me for using my phone. It was to pull up the exact language. So I think one of the ones that we, by and large, have done quite well refers to the grievance he has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power, meaning there was no civil control of the military. And by and large, the American military is the only military in the history of humankind that has not been a threat to democracy. We've had no military coups. Our soldiers are taught from the very beginning of which they take their oath to the Constitution that they report to a civilian power because the civilian power is elected and therefore responsible to the American people. That is a cornerstone of what it means to be a republic, and it is one of our most cherished institutions. I actually disagree on the jury trials. I think jury trials are extraordinary. I agree we should have more of them, but I think that one of the reasons that the judicial system is working right now is because we have things like grand juries that are actually able to assess facts and say, that's hogwash, get it out of here. And so that I think is really essential. The parts that have proven to me to be far more relevant in this moment that I would not have anticipated are for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. For a long time, free trade was kind of an agreed upon thing. Certainly, it was an agreed upon thing in the 1790s. And of course, we've had periods of isolation and tariffs. But I had kind of thought that that was a thing of the past. The second one that, and this blows my mind because I don't think it would have been relevant for much of American history. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, meaning the king was not allowing people to immigrate and to become citizens. And that was a grievance they held against him because they wanted to have people that wanted to be here and wanted to be citizens. For at least the last century, the United States has been blessed with the opportunity to basically have the first draft on the greatest talent from around the world. And we get the best brains and the best skills because they want to come here. And I think that is an extraordinary privilege and one that we have taken for granted.
Thank you all very much. Now, each of you has written important recent books that shed light on our founding ideals and our subsequent history. I'd like to give you each an opportunity to briefly explain the thrust, and if you want to pick not your most recent book, any one of your books, the thrust of the book and how it relates to the Declaration and our constructive report card. It's your turn to go first, Akil.
2 weeks ago today, I was on a panel on the stage just like this, with an audience just like that, and sitting right next to me was the greatest historian of the last century, maybe the greatest American historian of the last century, maybe the greatest American historian ever, Gordon Wood. 3 days later, he was 92 years old. 3 days later, he got hit by a car in a parking lot and he expired. I have a free weekly podcast, and this week I just recorded it about 3 hours ago. It'll be uploaded within the next 36 hours. It's a tribute to Gordon Wood, and I feature on it, I'm a registered Democrat. I feature on it the co-founder and national co-chair of the Federalist Society, Steve Calabrese. My work stands on the shoulders of Gordon Wood, and the story that I try to tell is a story of American greatness, and it's a 3-volume trilogy. Volume 1, The Words That Made Us, How We Become a We the People, 1760 to 1840. These are big, fat books. Volume 2 is how we end up rededicating ourselves to those 5 fraught words, all men are created equal. It's called Born Equal, how we get rid of slavery and promise equal rights, civil and political, to blacks and women, because they're born equal, whether you're born equal, whether you're born black or white or male or female. You're created equal, born equal. That's 1840 to 1920. I'm working on the 3rd volume, Earth's Best Hope, taking the story from 1920 to the present moment. We need a story of us. You're not going to learn my politics in these books. You're going to learn the story not of a me, but of us, and we need to know that story, it seems, because it's what we have in common. It's our history and institutions. And in that story, I stand on the shoulders of Gordon Wood, whom I'd like to remember today. And so actually go out and pick any Gordon Wood book. I'll give you 3 that are epic: Creation of the American Republic, Radicalism, the American Revolution, Empire of Liberty.
Thank you. Lindsay.
I mentioned earlier that civilian control of the military is one foundational element of what it means to be a republic. And there are 2 others. The second is the rule of law, and the third is the peaceful transfer of power. Those were things that were forged in the fire of the revolution, but it is one thing to win a war. It's another thing to actually create a nation. And many of the practices that we associate with our new nation were established through norm and custom by George Washington, which was largely the subject of my first book. But they would just be interesting historical anomalies if they're not repeated. And so the topic of my second book, the one that's available tonight, Making the Presidency, is about how does the presidency and these essential practices, the peaceful transfer of power and civilian control of the military and respect for the rule of law, how do they work when you have someone other than Washington in that office, when you have a mere mortal that's going to be challenged and pushed by people in his own party and that of the other party and foreign nations? And the moral, I think, of this story is that these things that we hold so central to what we are today had to be taught. They had to be learned, and Americans had to develop a practice of cherishing them and participating in them to uphold them, because they don't exist in a state of nature, and they absolutely did not exist in the 18th century, which was the age of monarchs and dictators. And in a time when Napoleon was fighting his way back into power multiple times because he didn't want to give it up, Americans, starting with Washington and Adams, established an expectation that you give up power willingly. And if you lose, you go home and you write a letter back to your successor saying, I wish you a safe and happy administration. And that's what it means to have a republic.
Yuval.
So my most recent book is a look at the American Constitution through the lens of national cohesion, national unity. A view of the Constitution that I think could be very useful to us in a moment that feels very divided. Because seeing these problems through the Constitution, which in a lot of ways was framed and built to address just these problems, when it sets out its first goal in the preamble, the very first purpose is to form a more perfect union. The challenge that the authors of the Constitution set out to confront had a lot to do with the ways in which they were divided. But in an even deeper sense than that, the challenge is rooted in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration says that we are all created equal. And the fact that we're created equal has really 2 kinds of implications for a mode of government. On the one hand, it points toward majority rule. If we're all equal, no one has natural authority over anybody else, and ultimately we have to make decisions by taking a vote. But if we're all equal, then we all have equal rights as individuals, even if we're in the minority. And so at the same time, we have to advance majority rule and minority rights. And obviously, those are in tension. How do you do both at the same time? In a lot of ways, over and over in its various institutions, the American Constitution is an answer to that question. And it answers that question by suggesting that we can do this by broadening majorities, by legitimating majorities through debate, deliberation, conflict that ultimately results in common action and acting together even when we don't fully agree. And to see the Constitution through that lens, I think can help us start to see the way in which it is an answer not only to the challenge posed by the Declaration, but to the challenges that we face now. It suggests in the end that the problem we have is not that we disagree too much, but that we disagree too little, that we spend too much of our time, even those of us who are very actively involved in politics, we spend too much of our time with people we agree with, talking about people we disagree with, rather than actually talking to those people, engaged in finding ways forward around actual disagreement. We've backed away from a public square that consists of substantive, active engagement across lines of difference. And we now think that disagreement is a failure, that it's a sign of dysfunction. But actually, disagreement is the only way that a free society can work. And I think one important way to see that is to think about our situation through the lens of the Constitution and ultimately of the Declaration.
I confess I've been so engrossed in this conversation. I've lost track of time, but I think exactly on cue, we have our roving reporter, Professor Price, to ask some more questions.
Thank you, and thank you again for your questions. They've been brought up to the front, and we've tried to filter them down to these. So, question number one: governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. How is that consent properly obtained? And if your answer is elections, what about if we're making it harder to vote?
Who wants to take a crack at that?
Well, I would say some governments derive their power from consent of the governed. Some derive them from hereditary divine right. Some derive them from force. But for the sake of the question, we're talking about those in which we're a republic or a democracy or some version thereof. There are disagreements on this too, because there are some interpretations that suggest that when the American people come together and they form a government, they hand over power to their representatives to act on their behalf. And by putting power in the federal government and the state government, they've transferred it to people to act on their behalf. Others would suggest that that decision is made daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, biannually, or every 4 years whenever you're engaging in a civic activity, whenever you're engaging in protest or asking your representatives for something, or through elections and through voting. I think both interpretations offer merit and offer a lot for us to think about. But I think the most important thing to understand is that that elections, therefore, are designed as the ultimate check. They're designed as the ultimate way for citizens to express their displeasure, to vote out those who are not serving them well, and to bring in those who might bring in small change or perhaps large-scale change, depending on the moment. I will admit that I am, if Nadine is a free speech evangelist, I am a voting evangelist. I think everyone should vote. I don't think it's possible in our society to make it mandatory, but I think that we should view it as mandatory. And therefore, I want our elections to be safe as they are. We have some of the safest elections in the world, but I want people to have access to that. And I believe that that's really important.
Okay. Other comments? Next question.
Okay. This is from Johnny, who's 19 years old. How much weight should the Declaration of Independence actually carry as a legal text? And how do you respond to originalists who say importing the Declaration into constitutional interpretation is itself a form of living constitutionalism?
Well, the Constitution, on Lincoln's view, was designed to implement the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Now, others had a different view than Lincoln. Lincoln not only got elected, he basically got his vision of the Declaration embedded in a series of amendments. The 13th Amendment, for example, is an instantiation of this idea that everyone is born equally free, that everyone is created equal in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and therefore no one's born a slave. That's Lincoln's interpretation of the Declaration. Wasn't true of the original Constitution that had slavery in lots of places, but it's true of our Constitution, which is one of the reasons I gave it an A, because we have the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment begins, all persons born, all, Duvall's word, persons born as in created, and this is a narrower thing, in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now that's an idea. It's not universally Euclidean mathematical, as was the first idea. You've also said certain things are just true everywhere and all times, and that's the Declaration. But now it's a different idea. If you're born in the United States and under the U.S. flag, you're a citizen. It's not true if you're born in Canada under the Canadian flag, to Canadian parents or something like that. So, but it's, and Lincoln is evolving, but it's rooted in his understanding of the Declaration, which is growing, but he gets it embedded in an amendment, the 14th Amendment, and then
being a citizen doesn't mean you're automatically a voter. A 2-year-old might be a citizen. Women are citizens, but they're not yet voters. That's going to be the 15th Amendment and 19th Amendment. So different ideas about the Declaration of Independence actually are embedded in the later amendments, and we have to take seriously those later amendments. Even if the Declaration didn't have independent legal force on its own, we could talk about that. Many of its ideas are encoded in the later Constitution and Bill of Rights, all the jury trial provisions. Lindsay mentioned grand juries in the Fifth Amendment. We could talk about petit juries in the Sixth and civil juries in the Seventh. And they're in there. It's just the judges today and our legal system too often says, oh, jury trials is waived, defendant waived, you don't need to have it here. You can have administrative agencies or something. So we have them, but maybe not enough. But the Declaration is embedded in positive law like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, 19th Amendment, or at least certain interpretations of the Declaration of Independence are.
Yuval, you look like you wanted to respond.
Well, I agree, though. I would just add that we don't all have to think like lawyers and judges. There are constraints on what judges can use when they're asked to apply the law to a set of circumstances. Not everything that is true is law, but things that are true. And if we think about big public questions in terms of the American political tradition, I think we absolutely should employ in that understanding a conception drawn from the Declaration of Independence. That doesn't mean it's law, and I don't think it simply is law, but we're not judges. We're citizens. We're trying to decide what the future of our country should be. Judges have a narrower purpose than that when they act as judges. They're citizens, too, in their own lives. And so I don't think we should be constrained by what are basically methodologies of judicial interpretation when we ask ourselves what our political tradition offers us.
Okay. Next question.
Just the final question. This one's a little cheeky, perhaps. Around the world, Americans have been known as obnoxiously optimistic. That seems to have changed. How do we get back to build citizen engagement again?
I would just say Americans are still obnoxiously optimistic, and that's great. We tell ourselves we aren't. I would say one of the standard characteristic modes of the American personality from the very beginning is a kind of sense of impending doom about the country. Every generation of Americans has thought this thing is falling apart. Every generation of Americans has talked about the end of the Roman Republic and talked about whether we're up to sustaining this project. That's been part of, look, the American national anthem is a song about barely surviving the night. It is not about how beautiful our country is. It is not about how glorious our democracy is. The flag was still there. That's the amazing achievement. And that's been our attitude from the very beginning. So I wouldn't take too much from the fact that we now all walk around talking about how it's the end of the Roman Republic and everything's going to fall apart. That's what we do. If you judge us by what we build and how we think about the future, I think the rest of the world is right to still see Americans as obnoxiously optimistic. I would just say we should try to be hopeful, not simply optimistic. Optimism says everything's going to work out. I don't know if that's true, but hope says it can work out if we are up to it. And that's not a passive virtue, that's an active virtue. It says we need to do this, and I think that's true.
Alan, if you can wait a second, I'd like to call on Lindsay if you'd care to. You recently wrote a terrific Substack. I recommend Lindsay's Substack, as well as the Keels podcast, every publication by all of these wonderful panelists. But you wrote a very interesting piece comparing other major anniversaries, starting with the 50th and so on through 1976. Do you want to briefly tell us about that?
Yeah, it actually ties in so nicely to Yuval's comments. It's called Imperfect Union, which there's a bit of a theme with that title and tonight. And it explores odd twist of fate that every 50 years when we have an anniversary, it seems to fall in a time when the nation's going through some stuff. Maybe not that specific year, because 1826, if you look at that year, was fairly calm. We had just had the Compromise of 1820, and there was the threat of slavery and national division was hanging over the nation. The election of 1824 had been incredibly contentious. And of course, the founding generation was dying. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4th, 1826. You absolutely cannot make this up. And if you tried to pitch it to a producer, they would throw you out of the room. If we look at 50 years later, it was the 1876 was, again, a contested election. It was the end of Reconstruction. There was the question of whether or not the nation could be knitted back together after the Civil War. You started to have major economic constrictions after the war. 1926, you're looking at post-World War I, the sort of the craze of the Gilded Age and the prohibition movement, the rise of organized crime in response to that. And then, of course, 1976 was post-Watergate, post-Vietnam, high inflation, real distrust in American institutions. And yet we celebrate anyway. And to quote when I think of the all-time greatest, maybe hopefuls as opposed to optimists, Abraham Lincoln said, "I am an optimist because I don't see the point in being anything else." The enemy is not despair. The enemy is apathy. Because people who want the United States to fail want you to give up. They want us to not care. Despair is caring. It's just sadness. They want us to not care. And so I think these series of commemorations are an active opportunity, or have been an active opportunity and an active choice by Americans to say, this thing is still worth fighting and caring about. And I think my hope for this year is that we will have some of that re-engagement, that yes, it is flawed. Yes, we are in a bad place, but it is still worth caring about.
Thank you so much. Dean Rostron, fact check.
Throughout the program, we read all these cards that people fill out with their comments and fact check requests and questions. And they're really interesting and really thoughtful. So I really commend people for what they take the time to do on these. One of them related to a comment that Nadine made about how it seems the only people who know civics in the country are naturalized citizens and some students. So we pulled a fact that suggests that that's true. 90% of naturalized citizens pass the test, where they have to answer objective questions about American government and history. 90% pass on the first attempt, and when they give the same test to native-born Americans, only about 40% would pass the test, which I think is a sad thing. And this comment, so related to that, someone had a comment, Jennifer from the audience, said, as a naturalized citizen in 2024, I just want to say that I memorized the answers.
Congratulations.
Yeah. I memorized the answers to 100 civics questions, but I didn't know the meaning of most of them. They could have been in a different language, and I would have done just as well as I did by just reciting these empty words. So I would wish that they would require immigrants to take a history class in order to have a deeper understanding of these things. And I think that's a great idea. And obviously, all Americans, immigrant or otherwise, could probably benefit from that. Thanks.
Excellent. Many thanks to our fact checkers. Okay, so now my turn to ask a question. And I'm just going to, before I do, Trisha, I can't see you. So when we're out of time, could you?
Now she's telling you.
Where we are out of time. So that means I do get to ask a question, but it is the very, very last question, which is the signature last question for every APS event. And namely, that is, so what? Now what? And that is an opportunity for our esteemed panelists to restate their major positions, but fold it into active engagement by all the wonderful members of the audience and supporters of APS. So I'll just start with you, Akil. Go down the line. So what? Now what?
So the call to action would be to invite you to read more about us, about our history and institutions, because it's what we have in common. And when you read more and learn more about us,
if we're all doing that, we'll pull together and you'll learn more about each other because we'll have more of that in common. Since both of my colleagues, I passed on the last question, did use a word hope. And Lindsay in particular, I think even you all also mentioned Lincoln. Let me remind you of one of his quotes, because the more you learn about us, I think the more I would invite you, especially to learn about this amazing guy from the Midwest named Abe. And he said, "We shall nobly win or meanly lose the last best hope of earth."
In January of 1776, 250 years ago in a couple of months, Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense, "We have in our power to begin the world again." And I think that should be a motto for republics in every generation. But my challenge to all of us in this room, and hopefully those outside of this room, is what if instead of viewing this year as a one-year celebration or commemoration or time for reflection, we saw it as the start of an 11-year period of anniversaries. We are going to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Constitution in 11 years. And in that 11 years in the 18th century, they created the Articles of Confederation. They threw it out when it didn't work. They wrote a new constitution. They passed a Bill of Rights. They continued to pass amendments to close loopholes or address problems they could not possibly envision. They did not view failure with shame. They viewed inaction with shame. So it was okay to try things and admit that they didn't work, or to throw things against the wall and see what stuck. And they expected future generations to do the same. And the amendments that Akil has talked about tonight, the 19th Amendment, the Civil Rights Acts, these were all efforts by future generations to take that founding project and make it just a little bit more perfect. So my challenge, my now what, is let's view the next 11 years as our own decade of civic renaissance. Let's think about what we want to do to make the nation just a little bit more perfect. And maybe we start with our own communities and then we work up. Most reform efforts have been most successful when they start local and get grand in their aspirations. But I think this is an amazing opportunity, and I'd love to see what we can accomplish in the next 11 years.
Amen to that first. And let me say, I think that we need to understand this 250th year not so much as our country's birthday, but as our anniversary as Americans. And the difference is, an anniversary is an opportunity for recommitment, for understanding that there's more to do together, there's more to build together, if we appreciate what we have done together and built together. And by beginning from that appreciation, from that gratitude, we can build a lot more. I think there's a lot of reason for hope in America. But we can only really vindicate that hope if we understand what has made the achievements of this country possible. And that is Americans in every generation working together to meet great challenges and achieve great things. There's no reason to think this generation can't do that and can't establish the conditions for the next generation to do that. But in order to see things that way, we have to know our history. This is an opportunity not only to celebrate America, but to know it. And that's the action that I would call all of us to.
Well, many, many thanks to everybody who's contributed to this really fantastic and inspiring program, starting with our wonderful panelists, continuing with Johnson Community College for providing us such a lovely venue. Of course, American Public Square for instantiating so many of the so what, now what's that we have just laid out for everyone. And last but far from least, members of the audience, both in person and online, for your support, for your continuing efforts. Now we have a reception. I'm going to explain that the panelists are not going to immediately join the rest of you in the reception. We have a few brief photos to take, but then we will join you and we will be signing books as well as conversing with you. So thank you all very much. We'll see you at the reception very soon.